Washington, D.C.
Today, at President Trump's direction, the United States Treasury has begun Operation Economic Outcast, an unprecedented campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran and its enablers.
Tonight, Operation Economic Outcast. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announcing a global plan to cripple Iran's economy, threatened to punish any nation that does business with Tehran. But will the economic D-Day include China? Also, trade war escalation, the U.S. and Canada hurling both tariffs and insults tonight as both sides dig in for what could be an extended trade conflict. The Ontario Premier Doug Ford telling President Trump to, quote, kiss his blank. We'll have the White House response straight ahead. And breaking news, the Supreme Court just now throwing this year's midterms for another loop with a major decision handed down just moments ago. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And Joe, we kick off our coverage tonight on that breaking news from the Supreme Court in this decision over mail-in ballots. Let's go straight now to Kate Sullivan on the White House North Lawn for more. So, Kate, what do we know?
That's right. So we have some breaking news here. The Supreme Court has cleared the way for Trump to move ahead with his executive order restricting mail-in ballots. Now, importantly, it's unclear at this time how much the administration can change and implement ahead of the very fast approaching November midterm elections. But of course, Joe and Kaylee, you know, Trump has long attacked mail-in voting. He's claimed many times without evidence that there is widespread fraud. I remember covering him on the 2024 campaign as the RNC was trying to get Republican voters to vote by mail. The president was simultaneously attacking mail-in voting and really undercutting and undermining the RNC's message there. And of course, as the president himself has voted by mail.
Yeah, just as recently as last week in the Florida primary. Kate, this was a busy day for the White House. This news coming on the same day that the Treasury Secretary rolled out what the White House has described as Economic D-Day for Iran. We were short some details, though, as the clock starts ticking on nations to discontinue business with Iran. How long will they have?
That's right. That is the big question. So the Trump administration is once again trying to ramp up pressure on Iran as these negotiations and talks to end the war have really stalled. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier today unveiled what he's calling Operation Economic Outcast. It's an attempt by the administration to really isolate Iran on the world stage and get other countries to stop doing business with Iran in order to put pressure on the regime. Now, but right now, these are mainly just threats. Bessent said that the president is calling world leaders and making a direct appeals to try to get these countries to stop doing business and really sever these connections and links with the regime. He said that, and he also said that the U.S. is giving these countries some time to do so, to do what the U.S. is asking before actually implementing these secondary sanctions and these economic punishments. So it's unclear whether the U.S. is actually going to follow through with these threats. Bessent was, of course, asked at the press conference who he was talking about, who the president is calling, which countries he's talking about, and importantly, what is the timeline here? When are they going to have until? And he did not answer those questions. He did not provide those specifics. So we're waiting to see whether the U.S. actually follows through on these threats. But right now, they really are just threats.
Well, we did see follow through on the other threat regarding Canada and tariffs, which, of course, did go into effect on Friday after talks fell apart. Canada, Kate, now pledging retaliatory tariffs in return after Labor Day. The president suggesting more could come in January. How much further could this escalate?
That's right. So this trade war with Canada is really reaching new heights after talks fell apart last week. Trump is now making new threats. He made new threats today, saying that he would implement even higher tariffs on Canada. The president is threatening to increase tariffs on all cars, trucks, car parts, and steel from Canada to 50% starting on January 1st. Trump also continued to insult Canadian officials on social media, calling them clowns and saying that Canada really needs the U.S. In order to survive. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has responded, saying that he's not surprised by the president's threats and that Canada would match the U.S. Trump's tariffs dollar by dollar.
Kate, thank you. A lot to cover tonight from the White House. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, we thank you as always. Indeed, Iran is not the only nation in America's economic crosshairs this evening as the president vows to double Canadian auto tariffs by the 1st of January after trade talks between the U.S. and Canada fell apart over the weekend. Prime Minister Mark Carney suspending negotiations over several demands from the U.S. Of course, the U.S. has its own version there, and Carney promising dollar-for-dollar counter tariffs spoke before the cameras and the microphones in Quebec today.
There is a mutually beneficial deal possible here, but it has to be one that respects Canada's sovereignty, that respects our independence, that uses our complementary strengths to build something better, not tear apart for short-term gain. That's the offer.
Joining us now for more, our trade and tariff guru, Bloomberg's Shawn Donnan. Shawn, it's great to see you. Your reporting and analysis has been great here. Where Canada sees leverage in Trump trade fight, supply lines. This was a deal that did not have to fall apart last week, and a lot of stories had been written about it being codified. What went wrong?
Yeah, look, it was pretty close. I think at the end, both sides had some late demands that really just kind of neither of them were willing to meet. We heard from the Canadians that there was something around medium-sized trucks, those kind of Ford F-350s that are now due to be assembled at a new Ford plant in Ontario. They felt that the deal that the U.S. was proposing would really have made that plant kind of uneconomic and would have killed those jobs there, so they weren't going to go for that. Also, a kind of bigger question of whether or not Canada can pursue trade deals with other countries, with third countries, and the U.S. trying to limit that, particularly, and they've done this in other trade deals with smaller economies, aiming at potential deals with China, for example. And the Canadians saying, well, hang on a second here, that's crossing a line in terms of our sovereignty. We're not going to go there. I think the really interesting thing about everything we've seen in the last couple of days is both sides are giving each other time to kind of come back to the table, right? So the Canadian retaliation, we've got until after Labor Day. That's still a week or 10 days. That's a long time in Trump time, right? And I have never heard President Trump make a threat that is as this long a lead time as he did today in terms of saying that this 50% tariff on Canadian cars and steel will take effect January 1st, 2027. I mean, that's a whole other world for this administration normally. So there's a lot of time to talk. We've heard from Canadian officials that maybe they think something isn't going to be possible until after the midterm elections, just because of the politics surrounding tariffs here in the U.S. But, look, we'll see. These guys will sit down again. Both sides want to make a deal. They both have kind of talked positively about that.
Well, and the political considerations are one thing. The economic considerations are another. When you take into into consideration tariffs potentially on Canada, retaliatory tariffs that Canadians have put on American exports in return, plus potentially greater secondary sanctions on a number of countries over Iran, further strangling perhaps global energy markets. What kind of economic cocktail could the president be creating for himself here?
Look, he's promising a lot of disruption, right? And that is what this president does. He threatens a lot of disruption, and we often see him kind of pull back in the end. If you remember going back to 2015, 2016, he was threatening to rip off NAFTA. He was threatening to kind of eliminate the free trade agreement under which North America has operated for decades now. Instead, he rebranded it, right? And we know that they want to get there again. We know that American industry is going to apply a lot of pressure here, particularly the car industry, to keep this thing going. So, look, we'll wait and see. The Iran side of things is fascinating. I mean, I felt like today we didn't get D-Day. We got a kind of soft launch for D-Day. I mean, there were almost 60 individuals and companies that were kind of thrown out there as a list of sanctioned entities. But they're relatively small players that are mainly in trading companies, shell companies, that kind of thing. We haven't seen a big bazooka aimed yet at, and the big question here is China, which is the big trading partner for Iran. So, we'll wait and see what happens there. But, D-Day, hard to say that it actually came today. The Operation Economic Outcast, let's see if we remember it a month from now.
Interesting.
All right, Bloomberg, Shawn Donnan, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And now joining us for more is Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and is a combat Marine Corps veteran. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know if you would characterize today's D-Day announcement as being a soft or hard launch, but does the administration have the right idea here in moving to crack down on those who are continuing to provide economic lifeline to Iran?
Haley, nice to be with you. This administration has not had a single right idea the last 6 months waging this failed war. What we saw this week was the president pointed his finger at a country. He promised and then delivered crippling tariffs and hard economic punches, and that country turned out to be Canada. That's the administration we're dealing with. As we have an Arctic increasingly under contest, as we have North American missile defense concerns, as we need more energy for our economy, this president is picking a fight with Canada while increasingly losing ground against our actual geopolitical foes, China, Iran, and Russia.
Well, Congressman, if I can stick with the D-Day reference here, and it's great to have you back with us on Bloomberg. Treasury Secretary writing about Iran in the FT, the op-ed I'm sure that you saw, in which he promised economic D-Day. He said at dawn begins economic D-Day, the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary. We all remember, if we go back to our history class, that General Eisenhower wrote a letter. In fact, he wrote 2 letters on D-Day. One to the troops. That was the order of the day, very famously talking about your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. This is the stuff of history in the Smithsonian. The other letter that he wrote was in case of failure. It was found late in the game here, and he wrote at the end of that note, humility must always be the portion of any man who receives a claim earned in the blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends. Indeed, he said, if any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Do you think this administration wrote a second letter?
Joe, I think even comparing Donald Trump to General Eisenhower is an affront to the legacy of Dwight Eisenhower. You and I have talked about this, Joe. You got to ignore what Donald Trump says. He's all talk, all bluster, all sizzle, no steak. Watch what he does. What has this administration done regarding Iran? What they have done was come in with a half-baked plan, first promising regime change and then rapidly backpedaling to now they're just simply trying to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened. They're trying to get to the status quo antebellum. That is what we have to watch with this administration. Ignore the words. They're all just trying to play to Twitter. Ignore the words, focus on the actions. The actions speak to a war that has been lost, a war that this administration knows has been lost, and they are trying to find an exit as rapidly and as elegantly as they can, and they're going to fail.
Well, I'd like to return to something you said a moment ago, Congressman, about the need to push back not only against Iran, but also Russia and China. Should the administration move on secondary sanctions against Chinese financial entities or consider inflicting actual punishment on China for continuing to provide financial support to Iran? Is that not a good thing, or does it risk economic blowback to Americans at home?
The question, Kaylee, isn't about what good strategy would look like. The question is about, is this administration competent to execute against that strategy? And the answer is no. The job in Congress right now is to prevent a failed war from becoming a forever war. The job is not to empower this administration to wreak more havoc. Now, if you want to wind the clock back 18 months, imagine a competent president. You can see a situation where he doesn't pick a trade war with China that he loses. He doesn't pick a kinetic war with Iran that he loses. And instead, he goes to China and he says, we need 2 things from you. 2 things. 1, stop exporting fentanyl to the United States. They're responsible for about 98% of all fentanyl precursors. And number 2, stop importing Iranian oil. You do those 2 things, we can have a constructive conversation about trade. You don't do those 2 things, we're going to work with our allies to levy sanctions against you. That is a universe in which the United States could have accomplished meaningful action against the Ayatollah, and it could also have set the table for constructive dialogue with China on the terms of trade. That window has closed. This president has no credibility globally, and Congress's job is to prevent this failed administration from doing more damage to the American economy and American global leadership.
Well, you'll be back in Washington with your colleagues by the time the president is meeting with President Xi, assuming that that meeting still takes place. Congressman, what is all of this going to mean for the $1.5 trillion budget request for the Pentagon? What will be Democrats' response when this debate resumes?
I'm not voting for a single dollar to appropriate a failed and illegal war. I doubt Democrats in general are going to support this administration. The hubris and the arrogance is beyond belief that they think they can launch an illegal failed war and then turn around and ask Congress to appropriate it, no strings attached. Absolutely not. Again, this is not the situation as an American I want to be in. I don't want to watch my country having lost a war and thinking about exit strategies. But it's the situation we find ourselves in, because having fought in Afghanistan, I refuse to be a policymaker who sits by and does nothing as this country gets dragged into the third debacle of the 21st century. My constituents are sick of these forever wars overseas. They want to see the United States exercise mature, respected global leadership, and they want to see us eschew the kind of entangling alliances and foreign adventurism that George Washington has warned against, and his address serves us well 250 years later.
Congressman, I'm not sure you've seen the reporting about one of the sailors aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, which, of course, just got relief from the Middle East after a record amount of time at sea, is now heading home. He will be returning with the knowledge that his father has been taken into ICE custody. There's similar stories about family members of service members who have been detained by ICE, and I wonder if they have any recourse here, and if you have any reflections on what it might mean to come home after such a long deployment to that news.
I don't know the particulars of that case. I have heard some broad descriptions of it. There is pathways for those who enlist to procure citizenship or at least legal status for their families. What I can speak to are the immigrants in detention that I have spoken with in Massachusetts. I met with a man who fled Uganda as a young child, having watched his two parents be murdered in front of him by Ugandan soldiers. He then fled to the United States, has been working in rehabilitative centers ever since. Spoke with another man from Brazil, came 20 years ago, working every single day since then, no criminal record. They're sitting in jail cells, and it's not where the American people want them. The American people want border security. They want pathway to legal certainty for those who are working and not a threat to public safety. And they want a rational immigration system that provides legal pathways. This administration is delivering none of those three.
Well, there's a lot to be said there, Congressman, and Democrats will have a chance to say it on the midterm election trail. We asked you last time about your travel plans. I know that your group has been very busy campaigning on behalf of other Democrats. What's the rest of this cycle going to look like for you? Will you be traveling the country to deliver this message?
Yes, I will be in other districts to stand side by side with the kind of candidates who inspire me. I'll point to one example, Nancy LaCour in South Carolina. She is a vice admiral who was fired by Pete Hegseth for being a woman. She's now running for Congress to hold his feet to the fire. And she's doing so in a way that invites Republicans into the conversation, that grounds her platform in common sense, and that refuses to allow MAGA to claim faith, family, and the flag, but rather demonstrates that Democrats can be the party of patriotism and of a middle-class agenda.
All right, Congressman. Thank you so much for joining us. Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. We appreciate your time.
We'll have more on the administration's D-Day announcement, as they're calling it, against Iran, when the Heritage Foundation's Stephen Moore joins us up ahead. It's only here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone. Treasury has mapped every node, every facilitator, and every network that Iran has used to smuggle oil and evade sanctions. Beginning today, the actions of Treasury and other agencies will tighten the noose and block every potential source of revenue that funds the IRGC and the evil Iranian regime.
It's Ballots of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lines in Washington, where we heard from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, earlier today, starting the clock, if you will, for nations to extricate themselves from dealings with Iran or suffer the consequences. Joining us for more on the administration's so-called Operation Economic Outcast, Stephen Moore, senior fellow at the America First Policy Institute, former Trump economic advisor. It's great to have you with us on Bloomberg. Stephen Moore, what do you think about this? Economic D-Day is how the Treasury Secretary referred to it in his op-ed this morning in the FT. It didn't sound like an invasion. It sounded a little bit more like a warning. Is it smart to give nations a period of time to undo their ties with Iran, or are we already starting on a back foot here?
Hi, Joe. Good to be with you. Listen, I think this is the only question I have for the White House is why didn't they do this many months ago? It seems to make a lot of sense to me. Just so people understand here, what the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is talking about is what we call second-tier sanctions. So we've had first-tier sanctions on Iran for the better part almost a year now, where basically embargoing many of their goods and services and so on. And this is basically saying to the rest of the world, you know, if you're the friend of our enemy, you're our enemy as well. And we will see how the rest of the world reacts to this, especially our allies. But, you know, the one country that is most targeted here, of course, is China, because China still does a lot of business with Iran. But, you know, it's amazing because it's in China's interest for Iran to stand down here, because 80% of the oil that comes out of the Middle East and through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China and India and Asian countries. So it's actually in their interest to comply with this. But I don't know if they will or not. We'll discover that in the weeks to come.
Well, so is this effort worth anything at all without China, Stephen?
Yeah. I mean, we want our European partners, and we want Britain, and we want Japan and other countries to isolate from Iran. But the more the merrier, right? I mean, the more countries that do sign on to this and say we won't do business with Iran, the more as Scott Bessent said, the more the noose tightens around their neck. We got to get this over with. Everyone in the world wants the strait open. It's raising energy prices everywhere, which is just a tax on the global economy. So let's get this done. Let's get Iran to open up the strait and free its people. I mean, this is a regime that's been killing tens of thousands of its own citizens.
Well, look, maybe China will enter talks with Iran and have the regime stand down, to your point, Stephen. But in the meantime, do you think we have what it takes? Are we all in on this to actually squash China if, in fact, that is the secondary sanction? Scott Bessent said a major financial institution will be sanctioned this week. Will that firm be from China?
You know, look, I have to say it's probably beyond my pay grade. I don't know. But China obviously is one of the biggest trading partners with Iran. So there's no question, you know, when I've talked to people at the White House about this today, they're telling me that really China is key to this and to the success of this. And look, we'll know whether China's on the side of good or evil in this situation. But look, everything China has been doing with respect to Iran for the last 6 months has really been to try to undermine the U.S. economy. So we'll see. I don't know if they're going to cooperate or not.
Well, if this is about being on the side of good or evil, would you typically historically classify Canada as being on the evil side of the equation when we think about partners throughout the world? Obviously, one of our largest markets for trade. Now we're seeing the escalation of retaliatory tariffs slapped on each other at varying levels, with the promise of more to come in January. Is that smart economics, Stephen?
I'm not a big fan of it. I'm a free trade guy, and I like low tariffs. And I've always been a fan of the idea of, you know, this goes back to Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, of North America being one large free trade zone, you know, all the way down to Mexico and all the way up to Canada, and make the United States, the North American continent, the energy and technology and agriculture capital of the world. And we can do that. So so I'm not a big fan of this, especially as we're dealing with the affordability issue here at home. If you raise import prices, that could make things more expensive. But on the other hand, I mean, there is a other side to the story, which is that Canada really is imposing some very high tariffs on American farmers and American manufactured goods and our technology. And Trump is saying that's not fair. And then Canada now is saying tit for tat. One thing is for sure that Canada has a lot more to lose here than we do. So in other words, if Canada wants to get into a tit for tat trade war with the United States, it's going to hurt their economy more than ours, but it'll hurt both of us. So I want to see a negotiated settlement. How about getting all those tariffs down as low as possible?
Well, in our remaining moment here, you consider the political implication. You've addressed the economic one. We're talking about hockey sticks, Crown Royal whiskey, goose down jackets. I'm sure there are a lot more things where that came from. For the Republican Party, for House Republicans running for re-election, what does that mean for prices between now and November?
Well, again, we'll see what happens with, Canada. This was only announced a few weeks ago. I believe that in the end, Canada will stand down. They'll lower their tariffs on our farmers and our manufacturers. And so the end game here, hopefully, is that both countries reduce their tariffs and both countries are better off. We'll see.
All right, Stephen Moore, appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for the time.
Thank you.
And now we want to get back to some breaking news this evening from the Supreme Court, ruling in favor of the Trump administration on mail-in ballots ahead of the midterm elections. We're joined by Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr for more. So, Greg, once again, this is a for now situation. So walk us through what it is exactly that the justices decided here.
Yeah, and we really do need to lean into the for now because the court said that, we're not deciding the underlying challenge here. So this is about the executive order that Donald Trump issued about 5 months ago that was going to restrict mail ballots. And the key to that was using the Postal Service to limit ballots to who could receive ballots sent out by the states. And the court in this decision said a challenge to that was premature because those rules, the rules that would flow from the executive order, hadn't been finalized. In particular, the Postal Service just issued its final rule, and the court said, essentially, you have to wait until that final rule is ready to go.
So it sounds like we have no sense of how the court might rule on this. This is purely procedural?
At least according to what they say in the majority. Yeah. And the dissent, too, is trying to downplay it, saying that, all this does is postpone adjudication of these challenges. So we are going to see this again at the Supreme Court probably very, very quickly. There is a separate case before a federal judge in Boston, and she's probably going to move very quickly to consider the impact of that final Postal Service rule that is going to be finalized on Wednesday.
Well, so if the rule's finalized on Wednesday and the judge will move quickly, is it a given that this will be resolved by the time mail-in ballots are typically sent out ahead of the midterms?
Well, it's actually possible that we've already kind of gotten to the point where it's too late. So the Justice Department actually said earlier that we need to have this implemented by early to mid-August. We're obviously past that already. The one thing I'm confident of is that whoever loses before the district judge is going to move very, very quickly to try to get it up to the Supreme Court for a final decision in advance of November.
Wow. Great stuff with the breaking story, Greg. Thank you so much. Greg Stohr, live in Washington. As we turn to the big week in Wyoming as the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium gets underway, with all eyes, of course, on Fed Chair Kevin Warsh as he prepares to deliver his first annual symposium address. Bloomberg will be live on location from Wyoming. Bloomberg's Mike McKee, with his 10-gallon hat, will help to steer it all. He joins us right now from Wyoming. Michael, it's great to see you. Is there a world in which Kevin Warsh makes no news?
Yes, there is. And I think that to the best of his ability, he's going to try to do that. There's no real benefit to him in talking about anything that has to do with Treasury, Scott Bessent, tariffs, the bond buying program. He will avoid those topics. He does have a bit of an imperative from the markets to talk about what his goals are and maybe to give them some sort of what we call the reaction function. If something happens, like inflation going up, what would the reaction be? Would you move to try to move policy to try to bring it down? And that's been what's been missing from the Warsh doctrine so far, and that's what the markets have been upset about. And there have been leaks to some newspapers that suggest that that's going to be his main goal.
Okay, well, how could then, if he's talking about the reaction function to things like inflation, his remarks be shaped by the inflation data that we're going to get on Wednesday? Could that be a needle mover in terms of data before a September decision?
Probably not. We pretty much know what we're going to get on Wednesday from the PCE numbers because they're constructed from the producer price and consumer price indexes that we already got earlier in the month. It's the August CPI that we get on September 12th that's really going to matter and set the tone, because we saw the big drop in the CPI as energy prices went down in June in the July CPI report. So the August CPI report is either going to tell us that we are still making progress on inflation or that it has stopped and that was a bit of a one-off because of the on and off sort of situation in the Middle East. And if we see inflation going up again, then you're likely to see the markets price in more and sooner Fed rate increases, and you'll see support grow among those on the Open Market Committee who want to raise rates.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike McKee going to have a busy week in Jackson Hole. Thanks for joining us. Already out in Wyoming. We appreciate it. And now to turn back to the breaking news we were discussing involving the Supreme Court this hour. Let's get live reaction now from the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta. Mr. Attorney General, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We were just discussing with our colleague Greg Stohr about how the Supreme Court is simply allowing this to move forward for now. This is by no means a final ruling, but is it one that California would have to accept if the justices ultimately do decide on the merits that the suggestions President Trump has pushed the U.S. Postal Service to make regarding mail-in ballots do move forward?
We're a long way from that. This is a purely procedural order, ruling on things called standing and justiciability, meaning is it ripe? Is it ready to be even a case that can go to court and be decided on? And so it's not anywhere near the merits stage yet. They haven't talked about the merits. They were waiting for a final rule to be issued on this executive order relating to, in our view, the unconstitutional, unlawful use of the U.S. Postal Service to undermine free and fair voting by eligible American voters across the country. And so we are prepared to bring a lawsuit on the final rule now that the rule is final, and that will tee up the merits, the substance of the executive order, its legality, or as we argue, lack thereof. So that will go back to federal trial court and appellate court. And should it ever get to the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, as we always do, we will honor their ruling. But we think we will win this case in every court, including the federal trial court, the appellate court, and the U.S. Supreme Court.
We appreciate your weighing in on that, Attorney General, and welcome back to Bloomberg. We invited you to talk about a number of issues, including Paramount's merger with Warner Brothers. You were supposed to meet with Paramount today, and there's been a lot of reporting about this, that you canceled that meeting, accusing the company of playing games. What happened?
Yeah, I pulled down the meeting today because, in my view, Paramount was being too cute. They were playing games. They were disclosing through leaks to the press information that's supposed to be confidential and lying about it. They were leaking lies to the press. And in order to have productive and legally compliant settlement negotiations, they need to be confidential. There needs to be some trust in the room. There needs to be opportunity to share ideas, be candid, maybe be creative. And they undermine that by violating the rules of engagement. It's something that most attorneys never do, but they decided to do it. And so that was a problem for us. We did have some preliminary early settlement negotiations on Friday. And then on Saturday and Sunday, we started reading about the alleged substance of those conversations in the press, where they were naming sources that had to be Paramount-Warner Brothers. So that doesn't work. That doesn't fly. So we rescheduled, or we took down the meeting until such time as they are prepared to follow the rules.
Well, we should note that Paramount, in a statement, denied being the source of any leaks, Mr. Attorney General. They said they share your concerns about the public discussions and misreporting that has surrounded this deal. Quote, as we have assured the Attorney General's office, Paramount has not been the source of any of the leaks or of any of our confidential discussions with the AG's office. You obviously understand this went down a very different way. But has this meeting been rescheduled, or does that statement indicate that you and Paramount have not found a way to see eye to eye on movement forward?
It's completely on them. And let me just first say this idea that they're not responsible. Someone's responsible for the leaks. They don't just appear out of thin air. They have an army of attorneys. They have an army of consultants. They need to figure out who's responsible, put a lid on it, end it, and move forward in the appropriate way. And it's up to them whether they can, are interested in, or will do that. As soon as they do, we're ready to sit down and talk. So that can be soon if they can address the issue soon.
I'm sure your phone is ringing a lot lately, Attorney General, not just with the legal representatives on both sides of this, but from politicians in your state. There are growing calls to reach a settlement for the sake of jobs, for the sake of the Hollywood industry. And one of them is Governor Newsom. Are you now fundamentally at odds with the governor over this deal?
Not at all. I think I'm fundamentally consistent with him, with Governor to-be Javier Becerra, with others. You know, we've always said, I've said it before, I'll say it now, I'll say it in the future, we always prefer to be able to resolve disputes in the boardroom, not the courtroom. If a opposing party in one of our lawsuits in good faith and sincerely reaches out to us to try to productively resolve a case, we'll take that meeting and we'll work to resolve the case. So what they're asking for is what I've always said. And what I will do here, if Paramount can get themselves in order and fix their issues with these lying leaks and engage the right way.
Well, when we consider the engagement and what you hope to get out of it, Mr. Attorney General, what in your mind would resolve your concerns around consolidation and eroding competition? Might it require the sale of Paramount Pictures or Warner Brothers Studios? Is there a way to address your concerns without that?
Well, we've always said that we want structural remedies, robust structural remedies. I've said that publicly, and Paramount knows exactly what that is. Whether they will propose them or agree to them is up to them. But they've continuously proposed behavioral remedies, like promising to behave in a way in which they make 30 movies a year, I think for 3 years. That's a behavioral remedy. It's not structural. So we've identified 3 markets in our complaint with respect to widespread theatrical release distribution, blockbuster release distribution, and cable channel licensing. And there is if they want to propose a structural remedy for each of those markets, we'll listen.
Last time we had a chance to speak, Attorney General, it was on the eve of the trial against Meta. Starting, something that you have helped to spearhead as one of 4 attorneys general. How is the trial proceeding? And will we hear from Mark Zuckerberg?
We think it's going very well. The evidence has been coming in, as we hoped, very compelling, providing all sorts of evidentiary support for our allegations, which I think are very strong, that Meta designed and deployed a dangerous product that hurt the mental health of kids, and they lied about it. And we do have Mark Zuckerberg on our witness list, and we're prepared to call him.
Well, do you have a sense as to whether or not he will come on the witness stand? What timeline could we expect to see Mark Zuckerberg actually present in the trial?
I don't know the exact when, and there's some parts of the trial that are dynamic and, you know, in different ways. Of course, we'd want to work with him and make sure that we can get him at a time. We always try to work together with the witness. So I don't know exactly when, but he is someone that we plan to call in this trial. He is in our witness list. Everyone expects him to testify at some point in this trial. And so when exactly that will be, I don't know.
All right. It's good to have you back, Attorney General. It sounds like we're going to have a lot to follow up on with you. And we always appreciate your time. Rob Bonta with us live from California on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, the president says he's on the ballot for tomorrow's primary runoff in South Carolina. We'll assemble our political panel next to weigh in on that and all the day's top stories. Only here on Ballots of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
remember, they say again that Trump gets a lot of votes, but if he's not on the ballot, people don't vote so much. I am on the ballot. We're all on the ballot. Our country's on the ballot. You have to get out. You have to vote. I am on the ballot. We're all on the ballot.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was President Trump Friday night in South Carolina, campaigning for Darling Graham ahead of tomorrow's runoff Senate primary election. And joining us now for more on that and our other top stories is tonight's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, a Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, alongside Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Rick, when the president of the United States, and welcome to you both, has to say, what I really want you to do is pretend, please, that I'm on the ballot, just come and vote. Is that a good sign?
Yeah, it sounds a little desperate. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that's what the White House political office conjured up for his talking points, but he is his own message machine, and he is sending a very specific message to the base of the MAGA supporters in South Carolina that, you know, take one for the Gipper here. And so, you know, you would think that you would be in a sort of easier situation right now where you don't have to sort of sound a little desperate. But my guess is that tells us that this is a closer race than they probably are comfortable with.
Well, following that debate performance in which Ms. Graham was not able to talk about geopolitics and even some of the more basic questions that she was facing, Jeannie tells you what about the potential outcome here?
It was a disastrous debate performance. And, you know, you think back to all the times when people have stumbled on questions. Somebody was just talking about Ted Kennedy was asked by Roger Mudd why he was running for president, and he paused before answering it. It was the end of his presidential endeavor. And of course, here you have somebody standing up on the stage saying, well, I'm not that informed about national security and foreign policy. And yet she still could carry this thing through. You know, it speaks volumes to where we are. This is a test of Donald Trump's ability to get these people out. And let's not forget, Republicans in South Carolina have been asked. This is the fourth time in just a matter of a few weeks, essentially, that they've been asked to go to the polls. It's a lot to ask of people. So a big question here is going to be turnout, because people are going to be exhausted in South Carolina going 4 times to the poll to vote in this.
Well, and then after that, can you get them out in November? Maybe if they feel passionately enough about the issues. When we consider those issues, Rick, I'd like to get your take on what we're seeing unfold between the United States and Canada at the moment. Obviously, Friday at midnight, when trade talks fell apart, the U.S. slapped tariffs on Canada. Canada says it will do the same after Labor Day. Then all the way in January, start of the new year, President Trump says even higher tariffs on things like Canadian autos are coming. Is this escalate to de-escalate ahead of the midterms, or could this potentially be something that just ends up fueling higher prices ahead of the midterms?
Yeah, well, tomorrow is Taco Tuesday, so it's probably one of those things that you got to consider. I mean, look, the fact that both of these are not immediate deadlines, you know, you've got a deadline in September, and then you've got another one in January. It gives you hope, actually, that there could be, you know, discussions between now and then that alleviate the crisis that is now looking like a trade war. And frankly, I think that, you know, from certainly a raw political point of view, not having Canadian pressure on U.S. consumers, especially in incredibly important states for Republicans like Maine and Michigan and Wisconsin, would be a huge advantage. Now, I know that politics shouldn't dictate the outcome of a trades negotiation, but everything impacts politics today. And so you would hope for an early resolution to this problem, not one that extends beyond the midterms.
Well, so, Jeannie, what is this with Canada? Are we calling it a trade war, or are you having tacos tomorrow?
I think that we are looking at a long-term dismantling of this relationship. Hopefully not completely. Hopefully it can come back. But it, you know, could we see them get back to the negotiating table and get to where they were, say, mid-late last week? I hope so. But the language and what we're hearing from the prime minister and the fact that he is being supported in all of this by the Canadian public, the fact to hear a prime minister of Canada weighing in essentially to American politics and talking about how President Trump is taxing Americans. And, you know, I suspect he wants to hold this through at least past the midterm. And let's not forget, you know, Donald Trump is on Truth Social today posting about how Canada is ripping us off. And they have been for years. But let's just think, it is Donald Trump who negotiated the deal with Canada. So if they're ripping us off, it's because he negotiated a bad deal. He hasn't explained how that could possibly be. And yet here we sit. None of it makes any sense.
Well, Jeannie, as you talk about the language, we heard some pretty colorful language from the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, who asked or said that President Trump could kiss his blank. And he was asked in an appearance before the press earlier this afternoon if Mark Carney had asked him to tone down that rhetoric. This was his response.
No, he didn't. I'm not going to comment, but he wasn't against that. And I have a lot of real estate on my ass, so he has a lot of room to kiss my ass.
Rick, do you think it's a coincidence that Ontario, which obviously is what Doug Ford presides over, also happens to be the epicenter in Canada for automobiles and steel, the very sectors that the president says tariffs are going to go up on when January rolls around?
Yeah, and by the way, an incredible provider to the U.S. of gas and oil. So energy is at stake here also. And look, Premier Ford is a headline-making machine. He's very good at creating the buzz, and he's obviously created a lot of buzz around various body parts today. And so the reality is it's just a great pressure campaign to put on the administration. But a lot of people think that if it gets to the point where Ontario starts to withhold things that are so critical, like what you mentioned, and energy, then the indications are at that point that the relationship between Canada and U.S. is going to be extraordinarily difficult to put back together. I don't think anybody thinks that today, but that would be the nuclear weapon to be used in trade.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, Doug Ford's going to be here tomorrow. I hope you guys join us on the late edition of Balance of Power, because we will be speaking with Premier Ford. You saw the president today, Jeannie, on Truth Social. Ford's lots of bluster, he said, indeed, suggesting targeting red states in response to the tariff threat, suggesting he could cut off the power. You think he's serious about any of this?
You know, I think Donald Trump has met his match in Doug Ford, and I am so excited to hear what he has to say, because to Rick's point, he always has colorful things to say. But
yeah, we might have to bleep him.
Yeah, you have to get ready with that bleeper. You know, this is a very, very serious issue. And let's just quote the Wall Street Journal. The president has embarked on a very stupid war with Canada, amongst the stupidest we've ever seen. And he's now paying the price at the hands of somebody who likes to bluster as much as he does. So I think the president might have met his match. And you know, let's hope they don't go down the road with the automobiles and the energy and so on. But this is why this is so stupid. You know, Canada is not China, despite what J.D. Vance said in Maine today.
Well, speaking of China, it's unclear whether or not China is going to be targeted with secondary sanctions from the United States Treasury, though Scott Bessent said no one is going to be spared if they continue to provide financial lifeline to Iran. Listen to part of his announcement earlier.
Let me be clear. Any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the U.S. dollar system. The clock just started ticking.
Rick, if the clock just started ticking, not that the clock has run out, is this D-Day?
Hard to tell if it's D-Day. You know, D-Day occurred on June 6th, and you knew exactly what you were up against What we learned today is there's going to be a process in place that tries to get us to a point where we can apply secondary sanctions potentially. In other words, if China doesn't do it themselves and withdraw from trade with Iran, the assumption is that we will sanction them. Same with Pakistan, same with India. And we've seen UAE already act, which is important. I mean, UAE is a center of trade for Iran. And the fact that they have kind of unilaterally jumped ahead of the D-Day is a good indication that there's more pressure to be made. But the rest of these regimes aren't as enticed into having a positive relationship with Washington. And so what's the impetus for them to play ball? I'm not exactly sure, other than pain. And of course, when you talk about China, you talk about the biggest trading partner that Iran's got. And with Xi coming next month, just a month away from today, do you really want to punch him in the face when it comes to his trade policies?
Great questions, Jeannie. Will that summit still take place if the U.S. decides to apply secondary sanctions on exports to China?
I hope the summit takes place. I am not convinced that we will be applying those on China because the president seems to want to punish our closest allies and hug, autocrats around the world. And so I'm not sure he will impose those. And we got zero in terms of details from Scott Bessent today. This, to me, is another in a stage of a war that the president entered into when he shouldn't have, and we can't find a way out.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our political panel tonight. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Doug Ford will be on the show tomorrow. I'll also have an interview with the CEO of Northrop Grumman, so stick with Bloomberg TV and radio.